problem with the revolution is that even though it was sort of a popular collective uprising, and there's a sense of sort of solidarity and camaraderie between those who participated in it, to a large extent, there hasn't, the principles and the values of the revolution, and really some of the conditions that make it probable for the revolution to succeed, have not trickled down into sort of the individual realm. That people have not comprehended to this day what it means to have been part of this process, and the kind of reforms that happen, not just on an institutional level within the legislature, or within the judiciary, or within the institutions of the state, but rather within the household. There are a couple of essays that I wrote that speaks specifically to patriarchy, to religious intolerance, to the view of illegitimacy. I mean, the term, the most ominous and problematic term in Egyptian society today is the idea of legitimacy. And legitimacy is applied in every sense. You talk about political legitimacy, or collective legitimacy, or social legitimacy, or religious legitimacy, or even legitimacy in the case of the article that I wrote in the book, the legitimacy of a newborn child. What does it mean to be illegitimate? And to be illegitimate renders someone sort of a pariah, or sort of a deeply stigmatized individual, almost absent from public consciousness, that they have no rights and they have no obligations towards society at large. So there is a problem with this issue of legitimacy in the both literal and figurative sense. And then, of course, there is problems like mediocrity, the absence of a work ethic, a real sort of strong nationalistic chauvinism that really just won't go away. But there has been some progress on almost every front with all of these different conditions, but unfortunately, it hasn't happened on an individualized level. It remains sort of a social resistance against some of these. So, for instance, one of the topics that I raise is this issue of spiral of silence, and the perception that if your view is that of a minority, then it's probably best not to speak up for fear of retribution or criticism, or being seen as a traitor or something along those lines. Today, virtually all minority views express themselves with tremendous vigor, and that, I think, is extremely refreshing and highly motivating. But the problem is that some of the dysfunctionality in Egyptian society is a product of the individual's inability to participate in a functional way in society, and that needs to be rectified. Now, of course, the state has a responsibility to produce the rhetoric and the policies that will deliver such a thing, but there is some homework that needs to be done on an individual level. We need to recognize the fact that Egypt is an extremely diverse and heterogeneous society. Yes, we are all Egyptians, and we're unified under one flag and one territory, and one geography and one sort of identity that is not linear. But still, despite that, there is such tremendous heterogeneity that we have to begin to rediscover, and not discover for fear of the fact that it might pose as an existential threat to the society, and not to explore out of enmity and the desire to obliterate difference. Instead, it is to recognize, acknowledge, and celebrate difference in Egyptian society. There is much that Egyptians have to know and learn about Nubian society and all of its sort of diversity. There is no single Nubia in Egypt. To discover more about the Bedouins among us, agricultural communities, fishermen's communities, the Western Desert Amazighi communities, Farafra and Siwa and Deir al-Bahriya. I mean, all of these are extremely complex aspects of Egyptian society, and in some cases have their own sort of distinct notions. And of course, there's the larger parameters of diversity, such as the Coptic communities, the Baha'i community, the Shia community, the Sufi community. So there's a never-ending sort of spectrum, if you will, almost infinite spectrum of different aspects of Egyptian society, and that needs to be recognized. And more importantly, we need to learn how to distill the values of the revolution in our daily lives. So, bread, freedom, social justice. This is not something that we expect of government alone, but it's something that we can help participate in. So, bread through charity, freedom by allowing others to express themselves freely without restraint and refrain. And social justice, being able to see that one needs to participate in a system where taxation is an important part of giving back, not to government but to others. Support through charity, helping those who are in need, etc., and having sort of a global vision and a humanist vision for Egypt, rather than a very, very narrow vision of identitarian politics. So this is something that needs to be done by each person in their own environment, and for every parent to realize that if Mubarak can be toppled, then so can the patriarchy and the paternalism of the parental generation. So there's an article where entitled "Who's Your Daddy?" and I'm really sort of connecting the relationship between the patriarch, the arch-patriarch, within the state, and then within religious institutions, as well as within the household. So there is a contiguity between patriarchy. So to deconstruct patriarchy, it has to happen within the household and government institutions and the private sector and the state at large. Outside of that, we're not really making any progress at all. The issue of sexual harassment and the sort of the growing sort of domineering control of public space to the detriment of women's participation in it is really, unfortunately, nothing new. It is part and parcel of sort of a growing and deep disenchantment with not only political realities but social realities and economic realities, and again the disappearance of both the state and its ability to educate the public about social rights and sexual rights as well. Sexuality in Egypt has, at least over the past 50, 60 years, become increasingly taboo, in many instances against the natural tendency of sort of religious discourse. Both in Islam and Christianity, there is sort of a healthy discussion of sexuality and gender relations. And unfortunately, much of this has manifested in the form of sort of a suffocation of sexual expression in Egyptian society. So there's that dimension. And then you've got the dimension of dominance and basic sort of paternalistic patriarchy, which in Egyptian society has sort of manifest in the form of the state's heavy-handed treatment of the public at large. And so the only way in which both individuals and communities and collectives, in some cases even bands of men, have been able to kind of reaffirm their masculinity is through the abuse and the violation of entire communities of individuals, men and women. It's women primarily, but there are many instances where men's bodies are violated. And really, the most intriguing aspect of all of this is that there is sort of a desire to reclaim public space on the part of communities that speak on behalf of pluralism and mutual respect. But unfortunately, this emancipation, both of women and of public space, is going to come at an extremely hefty cost. It's coming at a hefty cost for the revolutionaries at large, and it's coming at a hefty cost for women as well. Keep in mind that the violation of women in public squares, both in Tahrir and elsewhere, and even on a fairly regular basis, in a very routinized and systematic way, has been executed by virtually every political actor in Egyptian society. dating back to the Mubarak era, where police systematically beat and abused and tortured women for their participation in political action, through to the military, which of course has famously treated women in the most abhorrent way, the most famous being the Tahrir girl, or as she's known in the West as the Blue Bra girl, having been stripped in Tahrir Square. But this is, again, one of the very few instances that were captured on camera and were able to kind of galvanize public opinion against it. But in the grand scheme of things, the military has used sexual abuse really as a weapon of intimidation and a weapon of war, and successfully. I must add. I mean, there are, of course, communities that are of the revolutionaries that are resilient and continue to attempt to reclaim space, but it has, to a large extent, instilled fear in the hearts of women and driven them away from the square. And then you've got its counterpoint, really the other side, which is sort of a growing religious discourse of disparity that communicates to women that the only way to protect their personhood and to protect their bodies, the sort of the corporeal aspect of their identities, is to either cover them or restrain them in private spaces, and that really goes in direct sort of or there's a collision course between this logic and the logic of the revolution at large. Because the revolution is all about space, public space being communal, being shared, being diverse and pluralistic, and for it to be devoid of racism and sexism and various other isms. And so I think that the emancipation of women as a movement is being hijacked by a language from the highest echelons of the state that says for women to be emancipated, they must participate in the political process, and the political process subsumes everything else. Well, women are participating in the political process. They are voting in extremely large numbers. They are in various elected bodies. They're advisors to the president in the case of Pakinem al-Sharawi and others. I mean, so women are visible, and it's not about visibility. It's about reclaiming the discourse of what it means to be a woman in Egyptian society. And unfortunately, it is, they are, the women that are making their way to the top of this ladder, this political ladder, have either disowned the goals of trying to emancipate women, or have a different vision of what it means to be an emancipated woman. And that, I think, has been bidding poorly for what's happening in the Egyptian street. So right now there is an uncomfortable coexistence between the goals of emancipating women on one hand and the sort of the gender disparities in public space in Egypt. But I think all of this tends to come to the moment of rapture again, and I think in the next period, we're likely to be able to hear more sort of resistance against what happens in public spaces. But this has to become a populist movement in every sense of the word. That women have to take this upon themselves to use public space as much as possible. It'll come at a hefty cost, but still, there's absolutely no alternative to confronting sexism head on. And there are remarkable efforts to do so. Everything from monitoring services, hotlines, guardians, Tahrir guardians, and other such matters. I mean, if the state won't bring you justice, then, as I said, in the same way that every aspect of public life in Egypt has become anarcho-syndicalist, why not protection of women? So all of these are efforts that are extremely sort of grassroots and participatory, and really that's where it begins. But we definitely need an education system that's able to recast the role of women in society, and that has not happened. In fact, we're taking at least, we took a couple of steps forward with the revolution, and now we're basically falling backwards into a trough. As the curriculum begins to change and the discussion of what women's role in society begins to change. So it's an uphill battle, but it's a battle that is not just a necessary battle for the success of the revolution, it is perhaps the only battle that can help us recognize when the revolution has actually accomplished its goals. If 50% of the population remains unemancipated or with little to no aspirations or hopes or dreams, and continue to be violated on a regular basis whenever they step out of their homes, then this revolution amounts to nothing.